I'm the last survivor of the Holocaust in our family.
Behind the words, pictures, and artifacts in the museum are people whose stories of survival and hope come alive to inspire new generations of upstanders. One by one, these stories stir the soul.
Can there really be hope for us?
See, mine is 40018. My sister was 40017.
Holocaust survivors, their descendants, liberators, champions of justice, and courageous upstanders ask only this: hear my story, so that the lessons they teach will echo for generations.
I will never meet someone else like my father. But there are many of us who, if we come together, can keep his voice alive.
These stories will change you. They will move you to action, inspiring the best of humanity every day.
I'm Cori Silbernagel. Today, Cincinnati's Holocaust survivors are deeply woven into our greater community fabric. Each had a unique experience when they first arrived, and rebuilding often looked very different for each individual. In this episode, we'll hear from Tulane Chartock, a woman who played an integral role in social services that helped support some of these survivors and new immigrants. Tulane, thank you so much for coming to visit us today and to share your story with us.
Thank you for the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
All day,
Thank
every
you.
day.
So let's get started right away. Let's go back to your roots. You grew up in Cincinnati.
Right.
Tell me about what it was like growing up here and what led you to social work in our community.
My family was from Cincinnati and had been had emigrated, of course, in the early 1900s on one side, on my mother's side, and in the 1910s on my father's side. And I knew my grandparents very well because we lived in Cincinnati and they did too. And so I was aware of what it was like to live in Europe before the war. And I was a teenager. I'm now 95. So I was during the war, I was a teenager, and I don't think I realized, I mean, I know I didn't realize all that was really going on. However, I do remember one time my grandfather was very upset, and I mean, more than usual. And the explanation was that he had heard that there were Jewish people who had been mistreated in Poland, and he was aware of that, and passed that along to me and to other people. But I didn't really know that much about it. In 1942, I was 12 years old. My husband was a Cincinnatian, lived 2 blocks from me. Didn't know him because he was 5 years older, and he was served when he was 17, he was drafted, and he served on Iwo Jima. And so, you know, as the years went by, of course, we became more aware of what was going on. I attended the University of Michigan, where I studied social work. I also studied computers and wasn't smart enough to continue with computers. The first computer a university had. But I was glad I had done social work. It was a happenstance because I liked the courses of economics and psychology and so forth that it required.
So when you came back to Cincinnati and began to work, what drew you into this field?
I was very fortunate between my junior and senior years to have been a volunteer at the Beckman Institute, which was the hospital area, the clinic for the Jewish hospital at that time on Vernon Avenue. And I met a lot of the people who had come early from the camps, from the concentration camps, there, and it was just beginning to to be Cincinnati arrivals. But I met a lot of the people who worked in social work, and when I came home, I graduated at the end of 3.5 years, and when I came home, I was engaged to my husband, and we, my husband of 64.5 years. So
Wow, that's
so,
beautiful.
It was, and so as a result, I had an offer of a job from one of the workers who she was Edna Hellman, and she was my mentor and the most wonderful social worker, and had her desk as close as you and I are, and she was the one who told me that there might be a job for me when I came home at the end of January, because a number of emigres were coming to Cincinnati, and sure enough, I was fortunate to work at Jewish Big Brothers.
So I think that's amazing that this really special opportunity arose actually as you were still pursuing your education. And I love to hear that you came back home to Cincinnati and then went forward to make a difference here. You were really young when you started. Take me through what a typical day would have looked like working for Big Brothers.
Yeah, I worked 2/3 of the week, 2/3. So I worked from 9 till about 2:30, and I had a caseload of a combination of people who were Native Americans or American-born or whatever. But as time went on, and there were more families coming to Cincinnati, there were more children. Our agency served children from the age of 8 to 18. So I had a combination of different kinds of needs of the client. And what Big Brothers did was they provided a mentor for young children whose fathers were, for some reason, unable to be on the spot. Either there was a divorce or illness, or for whatever reason. There were many reasons. And both the family had to approve that they wanted a man who was not a family person involved with their child, and they had to ask for this service. Some people were recommended by Jewish Family Service. At that time, there was a very close relationship of all of the agencies. They were called the Associated Jewish Agencies at that time. There was not a federation, but it was a federation. And the executive director of the Big Brothers was very friendly. It was Grace Henley, and she was very friendly with the executive director of Jewish Family Service, who was Miriam Dettelbach at the time, and of the Jewish Hospital executive director of the social work, who was Leah Schlan. They were maiden women who knew each other real well. They had never married and were really involved in social work. And at that time, there was hardly any pay involved, but they were doing it because they loved it. And so there was never turf in any way or any worry about anything. So my typical day was, if there was a new family who came in, it was called cleared by Jewish Family Service. And anything, there was, again, no HIPAA at that time. And so no privacy. Everybody felt that using our good common sense and consideration, that we could pass information back and forth. So the first thing we did was call Jewish Family Service if it was a new family, and get the background. And then we would set up an appointment with the mother or father, or if it was a family, with the father as well, and with the child. And our offices were open from 9 to 5 and located in the Jewish Center. And so, and at the time, the Jewish Center executive director was Cyril Slaznik, and everybody knew everybody. It was seamless. And for the services, George Newberger was head of Jewish vocational service, and as we took care of our clients' needs as best we could, if it was in our purvey, we would assign a compatible young man in the community or older man to be the mentor of the boy, who would then meet the family and understand where they stood and what they expected and what we could offer. And we continued to give information back and forth with Jewish Family Service. There was a flow of information at all times on what the family might need. And the same was true with the American-born families. And we would make home visits. There were lots of home visits. They would come to the office. And on Thursday night, we would every week have an open house at the Jewish Center, where the game rooms were open to us and to the boys and to their meeting opportunity to meet other little brothers and big brothers. And they would play pool or whatever else they, or just sit and talk and whatever. So we as workers were always there on Thursday evenings. And that was a good opportunity to make a match between the men and the boys.
I think it's very interesting to learn about how the different Jewish organizations worked together.
It was seamless.
And I think it's beautiful that although each organization may have somewhat of a different purpose or reason, there was a shared common purpose between all of you. And that is it was important yesterday, it's important today. So, first of all, thank you for spending that time those years ago.
And people stayed in their jobs for a long time. There was not a lot of change. And so these people were very experienced, and I learned a lot from them. They were, that was a lifetime commitment for most of them. And it was really beautiful.
Yeah, yeah.
And there were volunteers. There were, at that time, there was a lot of volunteering. As I mentioned, when we had a child, if there was a need for medical service, all we had to do was call Dr. Jules Klein. And he made sure that he was a pediatrician. He made sure that the children got their vaccinations and that they were ready for school, and that he took care of all of everything medically. And if there was a psychological problem, all we had to do was call Dr. Stanley Block, and he was a psychiatrist, and he would either offer, advice or get someone who could or would. And the same with if someone needed a job, we would call Jewish Vocational Service. It was just seamless. It was easy. Yeah. It was wonderful. The community responded. Volunteers were wonderful. The National Council of Jewish Women, which is an organization, offered English lessons for some of the new Americans, and without cost. The schools and the camps were provided for the new emigres. with pay only on a sliding scale that was so minimal that it was just the idea. All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a story there. Shall I?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay. That one of my families wanted their child to go to camp, and at that time it was morning and afternoon, so they provided lunch for the children. And my supervisor, Grace Henley, suggested or told me that we should charge 17 cents, I'll never forget, for the week of the food for this family. And they were receiving money from the community in order to live. But this family, the father decided he would not spend that much money, 17 cents a week, for this child to go to camp. And he did not go to camp. And Grace insisted that we make him, the family, understand, even though we wanted the child to go to camp, that there was finite resources in the community, and that they had to be sure that these people understood how the use of community resources were being affected. On the other hand, to counter to finish that story, the child of that who did not go to camp that 1 year continued in Big Brothers, and eventually gave a lot of money to this community, and has been very active in your Holocaust Center and also in the community. So that was the progression that happened. On the other hand, at the time I solicited for, it was called the Jewish Welfare Fund at that time, but that was what Federation does now, and I ended up knocking on the door and finding that the answer was one of my clients, and I felt like, oh my God, shouldn't really ask for money from that person, and I sort of apologized, and she insisted that she give, because she taught in Europe that this is an important part of her life, of everyone's life, responsibility. Mm-hmm. So the community was diverse, of course. I mean, there were a lot of people, so they weren't all of the same, actions at the same time.
Sure. Well, and one thing that I think about often as I learn about survivors and their families rebuilding here in Cincinnati, but also in other cities around the world, I think about how unique rebuilding was for everyone. People, coming to Cincinnati had all sorts of different experiences in rebuilding their life, whether they began a new career or returned to school after years away. Can you talk a little bit about some of the unique challenges that the new immigrant families faced?
A huge responsibility that they had. They were young people. The young people, the very young and the very old did not survive. Mm-hmm. So these people were people who were just, as you say, planning to rebuild their lives. They were first, some of them had been married recently, some had young children, and they were, their needs were varied, of course. And your question was how did the community respond to that?
Well, we talked a little bit about that already. I'm wondering specifically, what were some of the unique challenges that these families faced?
Okay, language, of course. The children, of course, picked up English much more quickly than the parents did. They did not have an understanding of how to shop and grocery shop. So we would take them to do that. They didn't know how to tell time in the same with the watches in the same way. It just was a different culture that they grew up with, but they may have come. They did come from many different cities and countries, but they became a community unto themselves, and so there were those relationships that existed amongst them, and they one thing that I remember is that although the American-born community was very open to volunteering and financially providing as much as not as much as it was needed because everything was needed, but a good amount to provide for the immediate needs. But they didn't socialize with the Americans and the emigres. It was a different group, and they were both separate groups. But the synagogues and temples all provided Jewish services, and some of the people had a background of needing that, and some didn't. And some of the challenges were psychological. I remember there was a family where the mother barricaded herself in the upstairs part and didn't come out for a while, and we became aware of that and told Jewish Family Service of what we found, and we were told to call the psychiatrist, which I did call Stan Block, and he made something that I tried to utilize in my life afterward. He said, if you lived through some of the experiences that they lived in, barricading yourself when the stimulus came about would not be abnormal. It would be a normal experience. And I tried to realize that they did not conform to what we considered normal.
Yeah.
And yeah, there were difficulties with child parent relationship, just like there would have been in the American background. But on the whole, they wanted to adapt. Grace, my supervisor, insisted that we speak English to the children and to the families. And that made it difficult because they really didn't have that skill. A little bit, but not a lot. A lot of them spoke Yiddish and Ladino, but not Hebrew. Some spoke Hebrew, but Hebrew was not a language at that time, a living language. It was a religious language.
Right.
So there was that difficulty.
Right. The survivors ahead of coming to Cincinnati had experienced so much to the point you just made, whether they survived in concentration camps or in hiding or they managed to escape. I have trouble finding words to talk about how hard that transition must have been. One thing we talk about with students here who come to the museum is that rebuilding continued for years. This transition to a new life, to a new chapter wasn't fast, and it was really hard. I imagine that must have been hard for you and for the women and the others that you worked with. What was it like for you in helping the survivors transition into this new life as a new American?
Well, the difficulty for me was that I was so young that I didn't have a lot of life experiences myself. And so I listened to Edna, was, as I say, right in the desk next to me. And she really knew how to handle almost everything. She was my mother's generation, my mother's and father. So she had a lot of experiences. I didn't have children at the time, but I understood some from my book knowledge, but and because I had a younger brother and so forth. But it was not difficult for me because these people wanted to become Americanized. They, on the whole, they knew that this was going to be their life, and they, they didn't fight it. But they had their own society as well. As I said, they had their own community, and they knew each other, and we tried to. When I would speak, we would use our hands a lot. Grande, big, we just tried to do the best we could. But they learned, and and television was not new, but available for them. And they learned the English language a lot through listening to television as well as their personal experiences. And those who worked in the community, some Jewish hospital provided jobs for a number of these people in their kitchens and doing janitorial work or whatever, but they learned on the job to speak English as well. So that they were not only willing but tried. They put themselves out to learn to be Americans.
Interesting. How many years did you work for Big Brothers?
From 1950, January of 1952, 1952, till July 1958. So it was just the time that a lot of the families were coming over from the relocation camps in Italy or wherever they were.
Sure.
Before, different relocation camps.
Do you maintain any relationships today with some of those families?
Oh, absolutely.
From back then?
Oh, absolutely. A lot of the parents have passed away because I'm 95 and they were maybe 5 years older than I. And then different, ages. But I met them at the synagogue and at the grocery store and, wherever we were. They were part of our community, and we were, we acted with personal lives in our everyday lives. Sure, I knew everybody. People used to kiss me and hug me, and it was... They were very grateful for the work that the community provided for them. On the whole, they never felt it was enough, and it really wasn't. But it was important. I still see some of the children. I'm in a discussion group with one of the children who's now 60-some years old, and he keeps telling me that I should speak to our discussion group because it's composed of Jewish and non-Jewish people, but it's interesting that, and he remembers a lot. He was 8, or he was born in Germany, but he was like 8 years old when I first met him. So I knew all these people everywhere. They were part of our community. I must say, as I say, there was this glass wall between the Americans and the emigres. The first Holocaust ceremony Holocaust Day ceremony was at Israel Synagogue. Mm-hmm. And I was one of maybe 8 or no more than 10 Americans who were there, but almost all of the survivors came. But it was because they just didn't realize what these people had gone through, and I was in a position to really know what and it affected my whole life. Of course, it would. Any job does, no matter what. But this was a very special community position, and my eyes were opened as a young person.
Well, and it seems, what I take away from what you're sharing with me is these were the moments where you learned about empathy and understanding
I hope I
someone
did.
different than you.
Yeah, I hope I did. Yes.
I think that's an incredible legacy that I see is still part of your life today.
Absolutely.
This caring and desire to understand and be part of community.
Well, these people's needs were humongous.
Yeah.
They were trying to redo their lives and reinvent reinvent to a different format than what they had expected. And what they found in America was certainly different from a lot of the cities and shtetls from which they came.
Sure.
They came from, some came from big cities and some didn't. And yeah.
As we move farther and farther away from the Holocaust, the generations pass. We don't have as many Holocaust survivors with us today, but it's become incredibly important to many of the second and third generation, the children and grandchildren of survivors, to continue sharing their family stories to help educate others. What are your thoughts on Holocaust education today? What can we learn from the past?
Oh, I'd love to talk to that, but one other thing I'd like to mention before I do, and that is that some of the families wanted to talk to their children about their experiences, and some purposely did not want to talk about it because they, for various reasons, wanted to leave it behind. It was difficult for them to talk about it, and they didn't want to burden their children with some of their stories. And they didn't talk amongst themselves sometimes about the things that were difficult to talk about. So they wanted to forget in some ways. So bringing that to today, are you talking about the lessons of the yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I really feel that it's not just stories that we're talking about, it's their life experiences that they're talking about in these stories. And they lived through the beginnings, not only of the war, but the beginnings of the anti-Semitism. And it was also against gypsies and all the other things, but they lived the Jewish part of it, and they did, in many cases, become dehumanized before they even came to the concentration camps, and they were not allowed, as we now know, to provide some of the jobs that they used to do. They were locked out of many of the opportunities that they thought they had as young people, and they were losing family members, and they were leaving behind family members, and the press was affected. They couldn't get information. When I see that today, and that people call some of the press the enemy of the people, I get very upset when I see that the person who's in charge of Homeland Security talks about having a phone number to report your neighbors or friends. I could just fly through my chair. because these are the stories that these people told me about, that what had happened to them, not only in the concentration camps, but as things were beginning to unfold in their homeland. And little did I ever think, when I talked about anti-Semitism, that their stories or their life experiences would happen in America. It was so far from our value system. And yet I'm seeing today that there are generations younger than I who have no idea that this is all coming about in a way that, and the important thing is when the government becomes involved, as opposed to just your one or two neighbors that do this, but when the government has the power to affect people without trial and just report but no trial, and then have their army come and get you and lock you up or send you away, that rings bells with me. And it may not with my children until I point it out with them, because they didn't live this way. And it was not something they were familiar with. And certainly with my grandchildren, they had no idea that what is happening is happening. It really is very upsetting to me, and I'm sure to a number of people who understand how government is involved.
Yeah, I think, one of the values that we can uphold as educators of the Holocaust in this period of history is to remind people that this history did not happen so long ago. We are among a living history that is still writing itself. And I think when we can humanize and personalize the Holocaust through sharing the stories of these individuals that came here or went to any other city around our country or world, I think that's when we can offer an opportunity for people, particularly young people, to perhaps see a bit of themselves in someone who could be very different from them.
Yeah, and the Holocaust was a very expensive experience, both personally, country-wise, financially, psychologically, to the generations that lived it. My parents and their parents and the soldiers on all sides. It was a very terrible. It wasn't just a 4-year happening. It influenced lifestyle.
Yeah.
To a terrible degree, just an ungodly degree.
Well, and we spoke on the phone yesterday for a few minutes about some of these things, and you said something to me that I went home and kind of kept thinking about. You told me that these aren't just stories, that this is real life, and the survivors that came here, to use the word story, we need to denote that it was so much more. It was real. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, I feel this way. To me, story has a little bit of a connotation of once upon a time, and that it's going to end up okay.
Yeah.
It didn't end up okay for some people, and for a lot of people. and it was they are stories because they're a lesson unto themselves, but it was life experiences that really happened. These were not just imaginary that somebody wrote these things. These were real experiences these people had, and that we, as I don't want to say upstanders or anything, but as onlookers almost. We were at home in Cincinnati. I grew up in high school. Didn't have the same kind of experiences that Anne Frank, who was basically 1 year different than I was, that she had lived through. We didn't have that understanding. Not only my generation, but my parents' generation. And imagine they're the people who were left behind. And all these were total experiences that we have to try to understand and not just put into cleanly story. In other words, I went to the Holocaust Museum in Washington years ago. I don't know if it's the same today, but that car, that train car was so clean. That was not the story I heard. The story I heard was it was smelly and crowded and noisy, and people were hiding babies. It wasn't an empty car. Those are not the stories that I heard. So in a way, when I hear the word stories, I want to say it was stories, but it's more than stories. It's real life. We have to take some of these things seriously and not make them as clean or as sterile as they seem to be.
Yeah. I think that that's a really powerful message. Again, it's something I went home from work thinking about yesterday, and it's a good reminder for me to continue working for our mission, right? You know, we come to work each day, you know, we have our families at home and our lives at home, but to work in a civic organization, whether it's a social service agency, a museum like ours or another, we have to be mission focused.
Absolutely.
And hopefully in doing all of this work, we leave the world a better place than it was before. And I think, you know, for me, even if that is sharing with students these real life experiences, if those students then go home and can remember the name of Warner Koppel or another survivor, I think that's a job well done.
Exactly. And you know, we all have to have fun and live our lives because that's our experience. But we have to be aware of the things that are important, and being kind to people, no matter who they are or where they are in their lifetime, in their own lifetime experience, is really compassion and kindliness. I can't tell you how much that's affected my life when I realize what the opposite brings.
Absolutely. I think that's a beautiful message. I wonder if you might share something else with me, though. You know, the steps that you have walked were not easy. they weren't easy in helping the survivor community. What sort of wisdom would you share with someone else interested in going into social work or working with new immigrants today? Some of these problems we faced then, we face today in similar and in different ways.
Just that people are people. They are all different, have different needs at different times. Social work is I found it very satisfying. As I say, I really was poised to go into computers. I was good in math and had the beginnings of computer background. In retrospect, I'm glad that I went into social work. It affected my whole life in this regard, in terms of my value system. That's not to say that there aren't good people in computers, because there are.
Sure.
But what I'm saying is the opportunity to understand other people in social work is a gift unto itself. And I don't know how social work pays now, but it certainly didn't pay for women in my day. I was very fortunate that I didn't need to have that. I was able to have food on the table and to be able to afford housing. But I realized there are a lot of people who can't. And today, that's really important, because a lot of the emigres from wherever they come from have fled, usually, not always, but have fled with nothing more than their immediate needs. And that, I remember when these families came over that I dealt with through Big Brothers, that most of them didn't have money at all. They came with what was in their suitcase, and it wasn't money, and it was not stock or anything. It was just their basic needs, and so they needed and counted on other people to provide for them, and it takes a community to provide for that. It doesn't take one or two people. It takes a whole community, and a community who works together. And when I hear of what the emigres, and I don't know how many people are coming today, but I remember the Russian community was different from the community who came over from the Holocaust. I did do some volunteer work with Jewish Family Service during the Russian people who came over. They were a different kind of community than so if you can, as a social worker, not you, but if one as a social worker can put themselves in a position to say, what are your needs and what can we do to make it easier? I didn't work with all of the survivor community, because Edna had her, and even everybody wasn't with Big Brothers, but that was the basic demography of that time. That they were young people with young children. And so we did have an opportunity to utilize some of the same skills. But any emigre society has its own needs. And if we, as human beings, just as human beings, not as only as workers, but as just realizing that people are people. They're not stereotyped.
Yeah. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you want to share?
Well, I must say that resilience is what I felt was very important. These people wanted and did become Americans and part of the community, and in many cases have been very contributing members of the community. There were people who were so injured that they couldn't follow that routine, and we had to take care of some of their needs in a different way. There were some who were on their own who did have money in Swiss banks and who were able to do well, but it's the laws that protected some of us for many years in America, laws that we took for granted, and that made it possible to live and thrive and be productive, which the emigres that I worked with did not have the opportunity in their early life. I think that's important. You know, yeah. Is there something else that you want me to bring out? I can bring out many individual stories, but I think that has been done to a great deal, fortunately and wisely. Yeah. And you know, but I can remember the cooperative. One thing that I do remember so clearly was that one of the members of our Cincinnati community of emigres was really mistreated by the other emigres, and really they treated him and his family very badly, and we really didn't understand it. But what had happened was one of the some of the emigres recognized this man as having worked with the Nazis, that he, as a Jewish person, was forced to work. And he was a capo, or I think they were called at that time. And they felt that the capos valued their lives over the life of the other people. And so these people were making his life, and the community got together. One day I called and didn't find them at home. And after a few days, I told Grace Henley about it, and she found out that they had the community, the Jewish community, had picked up this whole family and moved them and their children to another city, so that this person could live a life. And these are things that don't always make the headlines or the press, and that just knowing that this time of how these people, what they faced, was unthinkable. We can't do that again. We cannot afford to do that to any group. The Rwandans, the Haitians, I don't care. You can put a different word in that you want to persecute. You can put a different word, a different group of people. It doesn't matter. They're people.
Yeah. And I think at the end of the day, we have much more in common than we have in our differences.
Yeah, and history should not repeat totally. I mean, sure, we're all humans and we do repeat some of it, but we should learn lessons. We should act upon those learning lessons and not just sit back.
Yeah.
You know, when I jump out of my chair to some of my friends, they look at me as if I'm crazy, and I say, "Wait a minute, do you realize what you're saying?" You know, yeah. I don't like to do that, and I used to not do it, but I'm now beginning to do it again.
Yeah.
You know, we have to act on some of our lessons, not just talk about them.
Absolutely, and I find it really inspiring that you do have this courage to to speak out and act.
That's an important point, because there are a lot of people who are frightened. And maybe if I were a young person with young children, I might be frightened too. So we have to have the people who can speak, because there are a lot of people who can't speak.
Yeah,
For various reasons.
sure. Well, Tulane, thank you so much for sharing a little bit of your story today. You played such an important role in Cincinnati's
It
community
just
then.
happenstance.
Well, and you know what? You still played an important role in the community today.
Well, I hope to as long as I can.
Yeah.
As long as I can.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this lesson in kindness, in understanding and empathy.
Well, I hope I've given you what you hoped that I could offer.
Yes, thank you so
Because
much.
there are many lessons.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we could have this conversation again and again, and I would learn something new each time. I would.
and I rethink some of this.
Yeah.
Thank you for your daily work and for all of your compatriots and colleagues.
Thank you.
To make sure you don't miss an episode, subscribe to our channel on YouTube. Let us know your thoughts on this episode. Our email is in the show notes. You can also connect with us on Instagram and TikTok at Holocaust and Humanity, and X and Facebook at CincyHHC. Hear My Story is a production of the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center. The center's mission is to ensure that the lessons of the Holocaust inspire action today. This series is part of the Cynthia and Harold Gutman Family Center for Storytelling and is generously supported by Margaret and Michael Valentine. Visit us in person at Historic Union Terminal in Cincinnati, Ohio, or online at holocaustandhumanity.org. Managing producer is Ann Thompson. Consulting producer is Joyce Kamen. Technical producer is Robert Mills. Technical director is Josh Emerson. Select music is by Kik Lee. This is recorded at the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanity Center in Cincinnati, Ohio.